Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Before I introduce today's guest, let me tell you about our sponsor, our advertiser, Wondrium, Wondrium, the former Great Courses, the teaching company, which I've been consuming and producing content for many years. And you've heard me talk about it before when they were just had the Great Courses and all their lectures that you could consume online. Now they have a streaming service that gets you access not only to all the great courses and their lectures, but also to other content like documentary films and series, and even projects like this. This is going to be my next one I'm going to take here. How to play chess. Lessons from an international master. Well, I know how to play chess. I played chess growing up like crazy. I belonged to a chess club and so on. And then I dropped it for decades, and then I started playing my computer right here, chess, and I've lost every game. And I have it on the lowest setting, too. It's pathetic. So I'm going to consume these 24 30-minute lectures. That's how it works. If you listen to them at 1.2 speed, you can get it down to about 20 minutes per lecture. And you can do the same thing by going to wondrium.com/Shermer to get your free 1-month trial. And you could try Chess One or any one of hundreds and hundreds of courses, content, films, projects, things like teaching units that you can teach yourself things differently. So go to wondrium.com/Shermer. That's wondrium.com. Wondrium.com/Shermer, Shermer, and you get a 1-month trial. You can just keep subscribing if you like it. Why wouldn't you? What's not to like? You get all this free content online, readily available for one short, small fee every month. So check it out. And if you don't, you can always just cancel. All right. Thanks for listening. And here's now my guest. My guest today is Antonio Damasio. His new book is Feeling and Knowing, Making Minds Conscious. Antonio Damasio is university professor, David Dornsife Professor of Neuroscience, Psychology, and Philosophy, and Director of the Brain and Creativity Institute at USC, University of Southern California. He's the author of Self Comes to Mind, The Strange Order of Things, Descartes' Error, Looking for Spinoza, and The Feeling of What Happens. I've read all those books over the years. He's a big influence on my own thinking about thinking. This new book equates feeling with knowing, and so we get into talking about what these words mean: sensing, minding, feeling, consciousness, being, knowing, sentience, mind, brain, and how all those interact in physical environments and social environments. We talk about memory, intelligence, the nature of self. What is the self? Where memories are stored, different kinds of intelligences, purpose of nervous systems, plants as sentient beings, not really, but the scaling up from simple organisms to more complex organisms, to what extent consciousness has an adaptive purpose. We think of consciousness more as a rheostat, turning the lights on slowly rather than a light switch. We talk about some of the neural correlates of consciousness and where it might be located in the brain, artificial intelligence. How many maps of maps would you need in computing systems for the computer to come online, so to speak, and be conscious or sentient? Mind uploading the connectome, and would that be you? No, he agrees with me. That would not be the case. That would not be you. You cannot upload your mind into the cloud, turn it on, and there you're located, not without your body anyway. And then we hit free will and determinism, and finally, where consciousness goes when you go to sleep or under general anesthesia, and how it comes back. And then finally, I ask him, what happens after we die? Where does our consciousness go? So you'll have to watch to the end to find out his answer to that ultimate question. All right, thanks for listening. If you appreciate the podcast, we're primarily supported through donations at the Skeptic Society. So go to skeptic.com/donate if you appreciate our work here at the magazine and with the podcast. So thanks again for listening, and enjoy this conversation. So let's start. I mean, I loved your book. I read it twice, once in audio and in the beautiful little hardback edition here that I think of because I've read all your books: Descartes' Error, Looking for Spinoza, The Self Comes to Mind, The Strange Order of Things. This one I feel is like more of a meditative reverie on making minds conscious, almost like almost like a free association of all your life's work into one volume of just how you think about all these things.
Yeah, I think you're right. And that was actually the idea, was to make a sort of distillation of where I was when I started writing it. And the interesting thing is that during that period, actually new ideas and new data came on. So it's not quite a look back. It's a look back and a little bit of a look forward, because there are very interesting hints that are dropped quietly, not to upset anybody who is not caring for exact data. So I kept the overall structure, but I actually was happy that I was able to get a number of ideas that I think are very important and that are being researched right now. So it's a little bit of both. But I always like the idea of reducing and doing something poetic in the haiku sense, and that was really the thrust behind it.
It's beautifully written, and I love it. Well, you do this in all your books, actually, pop culture references, literary references, and tied into science. It makes it accessible for everybody. And I have a fairly large audience now, many of which are not science people at all. They're just broadly interested in all kinds of subjects. So maybe give us a little brief autobiography of who you are, where you were born and raised, and how you got interested in psychology and the neuroscience, and then also how to go from a technical professional research scientist to a popular science writer.
Oh, well, that's you're asking for a lot. But, well, I was born in Europe. I was born specifically in Portugal, and that's where I grew up, and that's where I went to medical school and to graduate school, and where I became, if you want to know about degrees, both an MD and a PhD. My interest when I went to medical school was already in the neurosciences. We didn't call it neuroscience then. We called it just neurology in a very simple way. But I was interested in knowing about the mind and in knowing about the brain. At the time, it was really an interest in the brain because of my interest in the mind. And that's something that came out of a variety of cultural activities and references. I think I wanted to be a physician because I was interested in the mind, because because I knew that was the way to get at neurology. That would be my channel. And it's interesting because for a long time I didn't even want to be a physician. My father was a physician, by the way, and he was an expert on diabetes. Nothing could be further from my specific interests. But I thought that he was a very dedicated man to his patients, and I didn't think that that's what I wanted to do. If that was what a physician would have to be like, then that was not for me. At the same time, I was interested in writing. I think I probably could have become a writer and a filmmaker. I was very interested in film, and I wrote essays on film, and I wrote movie criticism, and I had a number of idols in my life, such as Orson Welles. And all of that then quietly disappeared before the marvels of the brain and the marvels of psychology, when I really started to study it formally. So, and to this day, I'm still interested in all those things that I was interested in. I have, in case you want to know, a plan that I have for tomorrow is to watch, I don't know, probably the umpteenth time, Chimes at Midnight, which, if you know, is Orson Welles' really last movie, and is his account of Falstaff, this great character in Shakespeare that traverses the Henry plays, and is this great knight, very, very fat, like Orson Welles was. That's probably why he was so interested in the character. And is both a brilliant man and a bit of a buffoon, and ultimately a very unhappy person, but with very human, rich sides. So I have not forgotten my beginnings in the direction of writing and movie making and movie watching and thinking. But I think my world is much larger because I now totally devoted to understanding how a lot of these things happen, how they happen biologically, not just neurologically. And that's something that you, having read the book now twice, you may have noticed that one of the hidden agendas in this book is actually to let people know that when you think about a mind and when you think about something like consciousness, stop trying to ask the brain to do it for you. This is not a matter of the brain. This is a matter of the brain working in great cooperation with the body. And it's an interaction. You would not have a mind, you would not have feelings, you would not have consciousness if your brain was in isolation, if your brain was like a device, say a robot, that was made to resemble a brain alone. That's not it. None of this is about the brain. All of this is about life. That's the critical thing. Life and how it's lived, well or not so well, in sickness or in disease or in health. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, I think I'll call you the Orson Welles of neurology or neuroscience now. In a way, you are doing what Welles did, but you're painting making a film with words.
I just have to grow quite a few inches and grow my girth as well. I have to stop working out.
Your work is. You did? You met him? Oh, yeah, that's right. You mentioned that. I think.
It was very funny because I have, of course, I saw a couple of photographs of that, which I actually can't locate right now. And it was sort of on the news because it was very strange. Nobody could understand what this guy was doing, talking to Orson Welles. But I remember the photographs I saw. He's sort of like the double of my height, and of course my height in width as well. So he was absolutely lovely man.
Well, my intersection with your work, and the reason I've always been interested in it is, my life's work is to explain why people believe weird things, in a way, title of my first book.
Right.
And, for many people, anomalous psychological experiences are a doorway to the paranormal, the supernatural, altered states of consciousness, and so on. And the problem is that we don't have a good theory of altered states of consciousness because we don't have a good theory of consciousness yet. And so all the things you write about in all your books, and the new book as well, is, shows you how much we still don't know and how much depends on the interaction with our bodies and our environment. I'm fond of saying the mind is just a word we use to describe what the brain does. But, reading your work, it's like, no, that's too limited because you have the body and you have all these emotions that are part of the mind that are not just locked in the brain.
Right. You see, you would not. And I think that if there's something that works in the new book, I'm always very skeptical, like you. I'm always very skeptical of things working because whenever I reread what I've written, I always find it wanting, and I keep changing, and I'm never satisfied. But nonetheless, one of the things that I think works in this book is calling attention to the fact that if consciousness has a beginning, as a sort of inaugural event, it's feeling. And that feeling, contrary to the typical impression that people have, is not about emotions. Feeling is about the states of the body. Emotions is something different. Emotion is something that has to do with actions. It's really about acting. By the way, we judge actors very often on whether or not they are good at portraying emotions. Nobody cares for an actor that is portraying something non-emotional. Where you find your measure of the talent is whether or not the actor is crying or laughing or doing something emotive that is convincing. And convincing means that you really believe that that person is in a particular state of mind. But feeling is totally about the body, And it began that way. Now, of course, you can also have feelings about your emotive states. That comes later. But to begin with, feelings are about whether the body is in a state that's compatible with survival and continuation, or it's in some kind of misalignment that can produce overexcitement or underexcitement, can produce pain, can produce disease, and very critically, can produce things that we deal with every day without noticing. Hunger, thirst. Those are two very critical feelings. And what is that? What is hunger or what is thirst if not about the body? It is thoroughly about the detection by the nervous system and the report to your mind that something is lacking and that your metabolism has just registered a failure in the amount of nutrients that it needs to have to continue going the way it is. So it's very, very plain. It's very engineer-oriented, and it really is a remarkable state that comes to consciousness because of the particular arrangement that our bodies and brains have evolved to let us know about those states. And consciousness, you have to begin to understand it through feeling. Now, unfortunately, the historical tradition for consciousness has been in the opposite direction, because we are, and justifiably so, enchanted with the outside world. We're enchanted and dominated by what we see and by what we hear, for example, in music or sounds of other kinds, by what we touch. That's all about the outside world. And of course, we perceive those things, and they dominate our life, justifiably, because you have to deal with what's around you, or you die. And because of that, you don't see this marvel that has been sitting there any second of your life, except when you are very deep in deep sleep or in an anesthesia, and that is your body with its life. So life is ticking away, and feelings are like a continuous musical performance. It never stops. The only suspension of that state is, as I said, anesthesia. And by the way, it's a suspension of the conscious state, but it doesn't change life, because if you would change life completely, you would die, of course. So anesthesia does that, and certain states of sleep also do that. You're disconnected from knowing not just about the world around, but also knowing about yourself. It's just that the world around is so powerful and dominates us so much that we don't realize that loss of consciousness is not just loss of the outside world, it's primarily loss of your inside world. And if you lose your inside world, then nothing goes. You know, the world outside has to pass through the world inside. That's the order of things. And of course,
to riff on a couple things. Just to riff on a couple things you said there. Have you ever seen this video? It's on YouTube of the actress Julianne Moore doing a kind of a sidewalk exhibition where passersby could draw out of a hat a little slip of paper that has a different emotion on it, and then she would just snap right into it. You know, like anger or sadness or any kind of emotions. And it was startling, just like in a nanosecond, she would just snap into this like tearful sobbing, totally believable. And then somebody would draw another one, anger, and then bam, she'd be angry, and you'd think, and it's like, oh my God, she's really mad at me, just completely, I don't know what you'd say, just kind of living the actual emotion, embodying it.
Right. So you have to agree with my characterization of emotion as acting. That's the supreme definition of emotion. You could say that's what Julianne Moore does in that.
Yeah, you've seen that. Yeah, so it's a kind of a behavior. So let me, you use a lot of terms in the book. Let me just rattle off some of these. You talk about sensing, minding, feeling, being, knowing, mind, consciousness, sentience, and so on. I'm gonna just give me 1 minute, just a little seg into this problem that was solved when behaviorism gave way to cognitive psychology. But my first graduate degree was in experimental psych. I worked for Doug Navrick at his lab at Cal State Fullerton in a behavior lab. We had pigeons and rats. And, he trained under Doug Fatima, who trained under Herrnstein, who was with Skinner. So that's my lineage there. Anyway, when I was writing The Believing Brain, I kind of addressed this problem of language. And as you know, behaviorists just say, you don't know what's going on inside the skull. All we see is actions, behaviors, the behavior of the organism, as Skinner called. Anyway, so here's how I quoted Navrick explaining this. He says, I reject mentalistic explanations of behavior. In other words, attributing behavior to theoretical constructs that refer to internal states like understands, feels that, knows, gets it, figures out, wants, needs, believes, thinks, expects, pleasure, desire, etc. The reified concepts that students routinely use in their papers despite instructions that they could lose points for doing so. And then I continue, it isn't just the students who reify mind out of behavior. Virtually everyone does, because mind is a form of dualism that I argue in a later chapter appears to be innate to our cognition. We're natural-born dualists. So when you're using language like again, these words like feeling, knowing, consciousness, sensing, emotion, so on, I mean, how do you know what's going on? And I guess brain scans or whatnot. But again, we're observing, as you said, emotions are acting. It's kind of an act. Ultimately, that's what we know.
So what we are doing is that, I think that the behaviorist position would be tenable sort of at the beginning of this great, long history of trying to understand psychology, trying to understand the human mind and behavior. And I can understand the skepticism if we go back 50 years. I can understand it if you go back even more, of course. But I don't think it's acceptable today, because we do have an enormous possibility of entering the human mind. And we enter the human mind to begin with. Forget about scans, forget about all the paraphernalia that I have here in this institute. We can go downstairs. We have a superb magnetic resonance machine. We have fantastic electroencephalography. We can do all sorts of studies that are obviously the modern capacities of neuroscience and of psychology. But you don't need to go there. What we have is the consistency of the reports that we all make. You can, with your intelligence and cultivation, describe beautifully what is going on in your mind right now, and I can do so. And of course, you do need, we are not going to ask that from a person who is completely uneducated or from a person who is very young and has not had experience. That there have to be certain tools available. But the tools that you, Michael, and I, Antonio, have are sufficient to make an observation of the mind. Now, of course, people could say, well, that's biased because you're not seeing it clearly. Well, we're not seeing anything clearly. We see it the way we can. And we're constructing. It's not about seeing or hearing. It's about, in fact, constructing hypotheses about what is going on, and then testing those hypotheses with the data that we have available, which happen to be more reports of what's going on in the mind. But the fact that it is in the mind and that you don't see the mind objectively the same way that you see a brain doesn't mean that it is less correct. That's just the nature of the beast. The nature of the beast is that we have this process that is given to us subjectively. It's available to ourselves, to our individuals, and at that moment is not available to others in the same way that it is available to us. So to us, it's available through the mind, through subjectivity, through experience, which is, I think, a beautiful word that describes what I'm aiming at. For other people, what they see is not your mind. They see the behavior that hopefully is connected to your mind. If you're not an insincere liar, a lot of the things you do are relatively well aligned with the things you think, unless you're expressly, as I say, lying or acting, which is a form of lying that is tolerable because it has an artistic goal. So in other words, I am all for the studies of the mind, and I don't think we, in this day and age, we should not have any excuses for being cognitive scientists. We are with absolute power, with good methods, and of course you have to recognize that there are limitations and that there are plenty of slips, plenty of ways in which you can make mistakes. But you can make mistakes with any kind of observation. If you're studying rats, you can make mistakes too. So it's not that if you're studying an animal behavioralistically, that you're immune to making mistakes. No, you can make mistakes anyway.
This is how I think about the problem of other minds, namely, how do I know what you're thinking or feeling? And I apply the Copernican principle to myself. I'm not special. And if I see you're crying or you're angry, and I know what that feels like, and I know my brain's wired up the same way your brain is, it's a reasonable deduction to make that you feel what I feel without having to, transport my homunculus into your brain to know what that actually feels like.
Absolutely. We're in complete agreement. And as I say, the case theater and cinema, acting in general is sort of the only exception here, because that is something that was constructed by human smarts to, curiously, to get us to be in states that are similar to the states that we have in our normal life. So the only reason for being in terms of theater or in terms of cinema is the possibility of creating moments, whether recorded in film or in a theater on a stage. It's moments that make you feel about other people and make you think about yourself in similar circumstances, which is, of course, a very great cultural enrichment, and which, curiously enough, shows how powerful the human mind is, how real mental states are, to the point that very early on in the history of human cultures, people wanted to generate theater. And they waited until the 20th century to create film, almost. But basically, they wanted to have theater. And the same thing, whether it's theater with music, whether it's opera or regular stage, it's always been about the recognition that what's in your mind is very important. And when you look, for example, at Shakespeare, there you have this immensely smart combination of beautiful words that are describing actions of the moment, and this amazing ability to look into yourself and to describe what's going on in your mind. It's very, very interesting how Shakespeare did that, of course.
You mean, in a way, the acting we're seeing on stage or film evokes the emotions in ourselves such that we willingly suspend disbelief that it's a play, it's a film. Not really the Titanic, it's a boat in Mexico at half the size, and so on and so forth. You just drop all that and engage in the emotions through the fact that they're acting, since you equate emotions with acting. They're acting, and we feel the actions as emotions in our minds.
Exactly.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's go back several billion years. You start at 3.5 billion years ago, whenever the first single cell organisms were, say. And maybe it's, the degrees of freedom is pretty limited. Maybe the organism follows a chemical gradient toward what would be energy capture of some chemical, or it moves toward the light or away from the light or whatever. These are fairly limited, and it doesn't have a nervous system, but it obviously has some way of detecting its environment. Would you say that's kind of the beginning of feelings, or how would you describe those simple actions?
Say again, I'm not sure that I understand your question. What's your question exactly?
Well, so the question is, like, in the book, you go back several billion years, and you start talking about, in other words, you're kind of reverse engineering our own brains and going, okay, let's go back to the simplest possible organism. It doesn't have a nervous system, but it's still able to act and move. And so why does it move to the left or the right, or why does it follow the chemical gradient? And the reason is I think, if I'm getting this right from your book, is homeostasis, right? It's seeking to find balance in its own chemical balance, intracellular versus extracellular chemical balance, and it has to find some homeostasis there. And if I'm getting you right, the point of feelings and emotions are to push us to do something. You're thirsty, so you drink, but you don't consciously do that. You just feel an emotion. So you don't have to do any calculations, like how many calories do I need today? Well, I'll eat this banana, that's 120 calories. No, you just feel hungry. So this is the purpose of emotions, is to get us to act toward homeostasis.
Right. So the interesting thing is that, of course, when you look at very simple organisms without nervous system, a lot of the regulation of the life of that organism, so the steps that need to be taken for the organism to comply with homeostatic regulation, to have the right rules and to be done, all of that is done non-consciously. So for example, if you take an amoeba, if you take a paramecium, you have very complex organisms that have a single cell, may or may not have a nucleus in that cell, and yet they're alive. They can regulate how energy is brought in, how the metabolism is organized, how excretions are taken care of, how that organism is going to be in an area with greater temperature or less temperature, with nutrients or without nutrients. All of that is being regulated, but it's not being regulated in a mental sense. That organism does not know, that organism does not represent in a mental state that there's a failure of something, or that there's plenitude of what you need. And so what is interesting is that only appears when organisms are far more complex, when they are multicellular, when the life they lead is more complicated, and then there's this adding of elements that are for a nervous system. And so you have complicated movements that require limbs, for example, and those complicated movements allow an organism to choose an environment where it's not too hot or not too cold, and where there is more nutrients than fewer nutrients. And eventually, once there is a nervous system, there's something even better, which is the possibility of representing what is going on, and with the dual participation of the body and the nervous system, having a feeling which can be that of plenitude or of hunger or of thirst, or something that represents, or for example, pain. The fact that there's something that is actually working very poorly in your body, and that if it continues that way is obviously going to kill you. And so something needs to be done to repair and cut that production of pain. And what is so beautiful is that it is the natural emergence of consciousness. We are so, whenever we talk about consciousness, the real key is to say we are conscious when we know about what is going on in our mind. This would be a very general description. So if I have the experience of being here, sitting at this desk, talking to you, Michael, that is very critical as the core of my consciousness. Now, what is interesting is that this complicated thing now that allows me to know that I'm here in the Michael Sherman show and I'm talking to you, that began ages ago in living creatures that preceded me. Once they had nervous systems, they knew how they felt. They knew if they needed more energy, in which case we had the beginnings of hunger. They knew if they needed liquids to maintain their fluids, and we began thirst. And if there was something awfully wrong because the creature had been damaged by another creature, for example, or by a fall, then there could have been pain. And pain is betraying the fact that the cellular structure, the tissues have been damaged, and that is becoming known in your mind. So it really is something that emerges very soon. This idea that we sort of became conscious when we were looking at landscapes, and then we go all the way down, is obviously silly, because we grew from very simple creatures and we became complicated ones. That's the march of our biology. So the possibility of having minds and the possibility of being able to describe the world around is based on this prior possibility of describing our world within and generating something that I can call the self. That's the beauty of it. So it really is the reason why the new book is called Feeling and Knowing, is that feeling is the primordial event in this march. Once living creatures had both a body and a brain, a nervous system, they could ascend to the world of feeling. Feeling of what? Feeling of themselves, feeling of their bodies. And that it became really their first knowledge. So feeling and knowing are the beginning of this, and they preceded, obviously, all these great possibilities that we now have, such as me talking to you at this distance, and seeing your face on the screen and so forth.
You'll often hear the phrase, when do the lights come on, when thinking about consciousness down the phylogenetic scale to simpler organisms. And I think this is a wrong metaphor because it implies a light switch, but I think of it more like a rheostat, where it just barely comes on, a little more, a little more, and a little more. But if we apply everything you said at the first part of your last statement to plants, it seems like plants are kind of a primitive form of consciousness. They move toward the light and to the chemical gradients of where they can get nourishment. They communicate with each other by their roots chemically and so on. Although we would never, kind of in our folk psychology, think of plants as conscious or sentient, except for the New Agers in the 60s. but yet by your definition, at least maybe it's the most primitive form or a kind of a basic form of consciousness or feeling or something, whatever the right word would be for plants.
Yeah.
And you write about that in the book.
I would describe it as an undergirding of what then became consciousness. It's not undergirding. It's there. I mean, if you didn't have what plants have, you would never have what we have. But it's not quite consciousness. I doubt that there is a mental representation. And why I suspect that is because they don't have the cells that could do it. There's something quite particular about neurons, because neurons have the possibility of creating networks, and those networks have the possibility of creating maps. You see, right now I'm looking at your face on the screen of my computer, and you're looking at my face. And that is really a map. And it's a map that has all these pixels, and they represent different colors, different shades, different shapes. That is something that there's clearly an instrument for us to do it. It comes out of our nervous system at different layers and levels. And it has this highly evolved visual nervous system. Together with this, there's a very highly evolved auditory nervous system, which is doing exactly the same thing, except the shapes and the ups and downs and the continuities are in the realm of sound rather than in the visual realm, but it's doing the same thing. And the two are synced, which is remarkable. But there's nothing in a plant that can do that. The plant doesn't have the basics, doesn't have the engineerings that are necessary to create that. And we do through the nervous system. So I think that creatures that are not possessed of a nervous system can have extreme complexity. After all, they do have a life. They have good states, bad states. There's metabolism. There's homeostasis. There are all of these arrangements. But there's no possibility, Michael, it's like if you did not have the possibility of taking notes about our conversation. In a way, one simple metaphor for what's going on, exactly. You can make notes, and your brain is making notes. The plant doesn't have that. The plant just is. And it is, in a way, the general contour is very similar to ours. There's a birth, there's a growing up, there are connections to others, but all of that is done without the plant having a sense of self. We can project the sense of self. We can look at a beautiful rose and say, oh, look how marvelous, how happy that rose is. Well, that's, it's poetry. And not very realistic. It's poetry about what one might think about a plant and its life. But there's absolutely no scientific datum that can support the idea that the rose knows that it is happy about what's going on.
But at sometime in our evolutionary history, animals started to be able to do this. So you use the metaphor of a map. I like your map metaphor. But how far can it go? Are there so you have like maps of your body, and so I know where my body ends and the table begins, and I can walk around it without having to be super careful because I have a sense of where I am. So there's a map in there of my body, and we know where in the cortex that map is located, and so on. But that also implies there's a map reader, like that, almost like there's a homunculus reading the map. But what I think what you mean is that there's maps of the maps, and then a map of the maps of the maps, and then a map,
correct,
and so on. And at some point,
it's exactly
self-awareness comes into play.
Yeah, but that's exactly. And we build a self gradually to having those maps of maps, and there is a way in which we can create broader and broader surveys of what is going on in our mind. And not only that, we can calibrate how much we admit in the mind of certain sectors of all of this reality. So, for example, if, right now we're in the middle of this interesting conversation, and clearly I'm not thinking about my stomach or my guts. I'm not thinking if I'm hungry or not, because I am properly distracted, quote unquote, by our conversation. If you were boring me, and if you started talking to me about things that I'm not interested at all, I would start thinking, when am I going to have lunch?
No pressure.
I want to get out of this, and so you would change the allocation of what you're really paying attention to and what dominates, and that's the other thing. This would be good for your viewers and listeners. It's this remarkable portrayal of something that is extremely plastic and elastic. There is a continuous mind. Again, unless you're in anesthesia or you're falling in deep sleep, it's there all the time. And it's there all the time with a different occupation, with a different setting. So if you're going to have lunch, there is a setting that is going to be at least partially dominated by the food you're going to pick up or what you're going to eat and so forth. But if you're having lunch with a friend and you have to discuss something like, for example, what you're going to do, are you going to sell your house? Well, then the entire mind scope is going to be occupied by material that has to do with where you're going, for example, to buy a house, how you're going to finance it, and so forth. And the lunch may take a backstage. You may not even remember what you ate and whether it tasted well or not. So there's this complete elasticity of the portrayals, and they're all in our mind. But you don't. It's not one screen or multiple screens. You have this gigantic screen, and what is being, or stage, and what is being staged, and what is attended varies depending on your, now comes the secret word, your affect. Because unless you are a very cold person who normally does not pay any kind of love or hate to anything, unless you are very reduced in your affective compass, what you are, you're constantly being dominated either by the intellectual interest of a certain moment or by the affect of a certain moment. Now, if we're having a conversation with this one, this is actually a good example of a conversation that has both. For me, all of these things, I'm passionately interested in all of this, and I'm delighted and I'm effectively happy to be having this conversation. On the other hand, it could be that there is a conversation that is taking place about one particular fact, say in our research. We can have, for example, I'm in my conference room at the Brain Creativity Institute, and very often we have here 30 people in a lab meeting. And we're discussing a particular finding. And at that moment, it's what the finding says, how it's described, and the ideas that we have for how it came about. That's what dominates the consciousness of that moment for the people making the discussion. It's not about feeling well or not feeling well. It's not about whether the sun is shining or it's pouring with rain. So there's this amazing elasticity. And by the way, it's interesting because when we watch a movie or when we watch a play, even if they're exceptional, what we're seeing is a particular collection of choices that the playwright or the filmmaker made about a particular story. And it's extremely rigid, even if it can invoke and evoke all sorts of interesting ideas. But it's rigid and it's fixed. You can put the same CD or the same DVD of the film, and over again it will show you the same thing. Whereas in our lives, we're totally at the mercy of how things are going on that day and all the circumstances around us that can modify the way the film is going to go. That's
interesting, yeah.
Very
just
beautiful idea.
One observation there. When I'm a skeptic of the paranormal and the supernatural and the occult and all that stuff. Yeah. But when I watch The Exorcist or The Ring or any of Stephen King's novels that are made into films and so on, I feel totally scared, anxious. I break out in sweat. My heart rate goes up. Blood pressure goes up. I buy the whole thing, even though I don't believe it. So this is what you mean by the difference between, say, feeling and knowing. Exactly.
No, they're different dimensions. And what's interesting is that they're both present in the normal individual. They're different ways. Actually, one way of describing them, they're different ways of knowing, actually, because feeling is knowing to begin with. But there's the knowing about our own life in our bodies and the knowing about the world around us. There are different levels of knowing. And, with the world inside, it's a limited universe. The world outside is much more open and can change by our changes. So it's very interesting, actually, from a physiological point of view. Feeling is all about the marriage of body and mind, and you have limitations in your fiction. If you want to, it's not going to construct a fiction that goes outside the boundaries of your biology, whereas you and I can write a short story or a novel about anything we want, and the sky's the limit. There you don't have boundaries. But the way our living organism works, it's so that it delivers in our mind a particular story that is highly constrained by who we are physically. It cannot go beyond certain limits. When you talk about just the feeling of the organism, not how that feeling can contribute to a story, whether it's the story of Falstaff or the story of whoever you want to have as a hero.
Okay, back to your maps. So I live up in the foothills of Santa Barbara here, and I take my dog for a couple-mile hike almost every day. And we do these little single-track trails. It'd be pretty confusing if I took you up there and just dropped you off and you had to find your way back. But we've done it enough now. He has a map in his head, and he's usually like 10, 20 feet ahead of me, and he makes the left turn, the right turn. He knows exactly where to go. He probably has a smell map better than mine. And so he and I have maps, but what maps do I have that the dog doesn't have? Like awareness that we're in Santa Barbara. He doesn't know we live in California. There's no map for him for that.
Right. I mean, we're constructing maps of our the historical events, maps about the structure of our society, maps of course, you have the maps of Santa Barbara, but you also have a map, for example, of the political landscape of California or the political landscape of
that's
the
a
United
map.
States. Or even a map, you can have a highly structured map of the universe right now. Actually, because of COVID, we're obviously going through a particularly bad historical period, not just the disease, but in part the consequences of disease, in part what was there before in terms of government malaise. And I'm not talking about just the United States, I'm talking in general. And all of these are extremely complicated maps where you have, where you map countries, you map situations, you map political divides, but you have the possibility of portraying that, and you have the possibility of thinking about that and navigating it, and then putting it down to words in speeches and writing of essays and so forth. So it's a very rich. I mean, your dog is very smart, but we're smarter and we're much more complete. And the infinity of things that we can obtain is remarkable. But it's quite remarkable that to begin with, he knows the trail. He probably knows exactly before you need to make a left, or so he knows that he's going to make that left because he's done it before, and he's probably using smell and vision too.
Yeah. So, but if I put my dog in front of a mirror, he has no idea that's him. And yet, as you know, if you put a chimp in front of a mirror and you put a red dot on his forehead, he pokes at it. And supposedly, if you paint a big white blotch on the side of an elephant, he pokes at it with his trunk. Dolphins, apparently, if you put a white patch on them in front of a mirror, they'll kind of look at it and swim around. And they in other words, they can tell there's something, that's me, and there's something off about me, so I'm going to poke at it or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm asking is, on the scale of the spectrum up of complexity, maps on maps on maps, at some point, self-awareness kicks in. And to what extent is that part of consciousness? You're aware that you're aware that you're aware, something like that.
Yeah, I think it is part of consciousness, because the interesting thing about consciousness is to have a mental state that is hooked into a particular organism. So the whole notion of self, it's about uniqueness. It's about the fact that there is something unique about my thoughts. There's something, and even if my thoughts are very similar to those of other people, because my thoughts are the only ones that are hooked to my particular body. But again, you need to invoke the body. If you're trying to get away with having consciousness or subjectivity without a reference to the body, you're lost. That's one of the big problems. It's something that still recurs in a lot of philosophical arguments, is that people don't recognize the importance of the living body relative to thinking. This is, our thoughts are not sort of floating around unmoored. They are connected to a particular unique organism. And guess what? They are being made by that organism. That's the beauty of it. And so there's that complete attachment of body and nervous system that is capable of creating all those thoughts that are part of our mind. And so that they're constantly, what we think is constantly, could use a word like reverberation, which probably is easy for people to understand. You think, and that reverbs in your body. And there's certain things that go on in terms of reverbing in your body that, guess what, get expressed mentally. So you have this two-way conversation. But the two-way conversation is very easy to explain because it's right there in the same organism. And that's the beauty of it. That's why the most important thing in the new book, Feeling and Knowing, and that's why the first word is feeling, is to explain that feeling is something that is internal, even when it is linked to the outside, even when it is a feeling that is about the outside. A feeling, for example, I have a feeling, for example, that I'm enjoying this conversation with you. Absolutely. But what's going on is that my body, as a result of what is going on in my brain and in its connection to the rest of the body, is generating certain states in terms of my musculature, in terms of what is going on in the spritz of certain neurochemical mediators. And if I was highly irritated in my conversation, instead of enjoying it, I was defensive and irritated, there would be a completely different story, because we would still be conversing, but lo and behold, my feeling state would be one of hostility and reservation and so forth. But this is continuous. It's there, and it goes one way or another depending on who we are. And it's spectacular, and it's always novel, and it's unpredictable. I mean, you can predict it obviously, if I did not predict that I was going to enjoy our conversation, I would have said no, which I have done on several occasions. But so there's a certain amount of prediction, but you never can predict exactly how things are going to go. That's the beauty of the moment. That's the beauty of experience in a particular moment. It's really quite a fabulous thing that we have, our own portable theater.
So I'm hiking down the single track trail. I'm hiking down the single track trail, and all of a sudden I come around the bend, and there's a snake right in the trail, a rattlesnake. Yeah. And I jump back, my heart rate goes up, and I grab the dog and run. And then I feel scared. Is that what happens? That the physiological changes happen kind of instinctively, and then milliseconds later, maybe 3 or 4 seconds later, I experience the emotion of fear and anxiety. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because you're depending on the judgment that your brain, given its knowledge, is going to provide you with. So in your mind, once you see a snake, you picture danger. There will be some flashes of the potential danger if the serpent would come towards you and attack you. And that's going to produce certain physical states that are going to have to be induced, and they're going to generate certain muscular contractions, certain spritz, certain neurochemicals, and so forth. It's a very complicated concert that you're going to play there, and that takes time. And so that's why you may be surprised first, and then you get scared. You may not. It may be that you're not scared first, and that all depends on the setting and how that setting in your perception is going to regulate the production of a reaction that is really an emotive reaction, the reaction of fear.
So do you think there's something to intuitions? Like people will say, well, I just feel kind of funny about being in this room or going down this alley or being in this particular environment. Like women, for example, are highly attuned to being assaulted by men, and so they'll talk about I just have a bad feeling about this guy, or just going to this party, I just had a bad feeling about it, so I left. is this a way evolution programming us kind of at a basic level? Follow those instincts you have, those intuitions, because they're signaling. Now you may not be aware. You can't say, well, it's because of that particular thing right there. It's just a feeling I have, and that maybe there's a certain logic, particularly dealing with ecological environments that we evolved in, other people especially that are threatening, that we should follow those because they're probably there for. It's a form of information, data collection.
Sure, it's data collection, and it sort of accords very well with the general goals of our minds. The general goals of our conscious minds is to maintain the organism as well as possible, to try to maintain it in good stead, to try to avoid dangers that could result in sickness, in wounds, and so forth. So that's exactly what happens. You take clues and cues that are in the environment, and you build an interpretation. And that interpretation very often happens non-consciously. Before you even, well, in some cases you can be obviously aware of a danger. If somebody pulls out a gun or a knife on you, that's it. You don't need to have an interpretation. It's right there. But in some cases, for example, the kind of situation you were describing, it's really the intuition is about not having a fact that perfectly predicts a certain event, but having facts that make it likely, so that sort of the general contour of a bad event shows up in your mind. There's a flash that makes you aware, and that awareness is normally portrayed bodily in a form of a certain amount of rigidity and fixity. People that have a sort of premonition of danger tend to control their movement. If they're walking, they may stop, or they walk in a different way. In other words, all of the things that introduce what we would naively describe as caution is something that is, in fact, there's an alarm signal, and it's telling you to watch out. But instead of telling you watch out in those words, it's actually making you watch out gradually. And at a certain point, it may become fully conscious, and you're aware that there is a danger, that you should do something. But intuition is an alert system.
Right, especially for, again, ecological environments that we evolved to be sensitive to. Our intuitions about probabilities are not good, like gambling and other things like that we fall prey to these cognitive biases. But, as Gert Gingerenzer shows, if you present these problems to people in a way that they're better at reasoning at, and it's this kind of Bayesian reasoning of probabilities of things happening based on the information I have so far, we're better at that than logic problems and puzzles that have symbols and things like that. So I think this feeling and knowing is such a nice way to think about the same way. And therefore the purpose of memory and intelligence is just think about memory for a second. This would be a kind of map, right? It's a map of stuff. It's like a historical map. This is what's happened before,
right? And
then I'm going to use that to make predictions about the future.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. We want memory because it will simplify your life. Instead of coming into every situation fresh, as if you had never lived it before, you already have part of the homework in the form of a memory that can guide you, hopefully, in the right direction, so that you more rapidly understand what's going on, you more rapidly can react, and so forth. So that's one of the main goals of memory. Another main goal of memory, of course, is to permit social life. For example, now that I've been talking to you, I can associate your name to your face, and the next time I see your photograph, I will put in the name, and the next time I see your name, I'll picture you. So that memory has all of these. It's really a help. It's an assistant to simplify your moving in the world, and to make shortcuts so that you more rapidly can respond, so that every time that I encounter you, I don't need to be introduced to Michael Shermer once more. I know who you are already. So that saves time. Keep going.
So you define intelligence in your book as the ability to resolve successfully the problems posed by the struggle for life. So would you see it as a way of engaging multiple maps, including the memory maps, to solve that particular problem based on what's come before in our environment or our social environment or whatever?
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, the interesting thing, though, is that we know, and that's something I talk about in this book, as well as in the previous book, Strange Order of Things, we know that bacteria, who clearly do not have nervous systems, who do not have minds, and yet they're intelligent. How do I know that they're intelligent? Well, they will behave very well in terms of being in an environment, and they, guess what? If there should be, if the ideal temperature for their organism is 36 degrees centigrade, they will gravitate towards the place that is at 36 degrees centigrade. And if there's something that is at 20 and they will be frozen, they will move away from it. Well, that's intelligent, except that is what I call covert intelligence. They're knowing it, they're doing it, but they don't know they're doing it, or why. So, and that's, it's very beautiful to think that there are living organisms that have this capacity of acting according to their quote-unquote interests. And what am I talking about, interests? Survival. The interests are defined by whether or not that creature, who maybe is a portion by its genome, is a portion, say, 3 days, and whether that creature is going to live 3 days or is going to live 1. And so the creature needs to be where the temperature is right, needs to be where there's a possibility of nutrients, needs to be in a place where there's not going to be damage to the structure. You know, these are all intelligent things, but they're not known because they're not representable. The great thing we have, and organisms, many organisms before us, is that through a nervous system, we ascended to a new plateau, which is the possibility of representing what's inside and what's outside, and therefore being able to map out a way of making this operate even better. That's the big transition, is representing and knowing. And you can't represent or know, be cautious of, none of that, if you don't have a nervous system. The nervous system is the big discovery of nature, because with the nervous system, with neurons, you can make networks, and those networks can represent images or can construct images, and those images can serve to guide you. So it's really a remarkable development, but it is that transition that really marks the difference between what we are now and what bacteria are. You know, it's really a big ascension in a different world, the possibility of representing, and you can't do it without a nervous system.
Yeah, Dan Dennett has this analogy with termites in Australia, I think, making these huge, beautiful cathedral structures out of mud. And, you know, some of them are like 20 meters high. Now, none of the termites have any idea they're making this beautiful cathedral structure. They're just making it to the thickness of the walls and so on all have to do with temperature regulation. And so his analogy is that this is what neurons are like. But at some point, if you have enough of these networks or maps on top of maps or networks on top of networks, they become aware that this is what we're doing, even though no individual neuron has any idea what it's doing. How does that happen?
You create representations of representations. So you really ascend by making quote unquote the story more and more clear. You basically add description. So what those networks are doing is describing the inner state, describing the outward state, and describing the connection between the two. So it really is it's a little bit, I can think of multiple funny analogies, like Chinese dolls. These things just get sort of bigger and bigger in the richness of the representation. And at a certain point, there are representations that contain all the others. They're embedded. And that's how we come to make minds and to create these very rich representations. And it's so very interesting.
Here we're going from, let's say we're going from quantitative differences, the number of cells in an organism or the number of nerve cells in a brain, scaling up. And then at some point, it seems like there's a qualitative leap. And it does seem that there's a gigantic leap between the other great apes and humans. Just go from my dog to the chimp and from the chimp to you and I. I mean, you could say, well, they're just more neurons, but at some point, it's not just more neurons or more.
No.
There's a huge leap in there.
Exactly. I think more neurons is, of course, true, but that doesn't help you much. It's the way the neurons are organized, is what they do, and the notion of maps and the notion of description, the notion of representation was tied to the notion of map, and the richness of the description that those maps achieve, and the fact that you can describe the same thing from very different angles. So I'm seeing you, and I have now a visual impression of who you are, but I'm also listening to your voice. And I can, in order to get my concept of Michael Shermer, I can actually join those two maps and make them interactive. And so with the sound of your voice and what you look like, plus what I know that you have done, and the books you've written, and the interviews you do, now I have an even better and more complex representation. But what this is collections of interactive maps that go in certain directions, and you can shape them the way you want. And the way, for example, I'll create a concept regarding you is going to be different from somebody else that you may interview and who may not know as much or may know much more than I do about you. So the maps are going to be different, but the essence is going to be the same. The essence is going to be that the maps have to describe something, and that something has to do with the physiognomy or with the voice or with what a person has done and when. All of these things are little accretions. You just add little bits and you come to very rich, complicated images.
Yeah. Antonio, move a little closer to your mic. You kind of sat back there, so the volume went down a little bit. How far along the pathway of studying emotions do you go with, say, the evolutionary psychologists who argue that emotions like thirst and hunger, which we discussed, have obvious adaptive purposes? But what about things like jealousy for mate guarding, or disgust for pushing away contaminants, and depression to get us to change our behaviors away from something that's negative, and so on? They argue they're largely programmed by our evolutionary history, and as you know, critics of evolutionary psychology say no, this is it's way more cultural than we realize, and so much of this research is done on weird people, Western, educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, and so on. How do you think about culture and evolutionary programming with emotions?
Well, first of all, there's certain parameters that are there to begin with. I mean, I don't think you've ever seen anybody who is, say, in fear that is sort of lovingly directing his or her arms towards you. And probably you've never seen anybody who is in love who is like this. So obviously there are certain things that are very well set parameters of certain emotions, and the general contour of the action is patterned. But then, of course, you have tons of individualities, because the way you or I cry in the detail, or the way you or I laugh, of course, if things that are peculiar to each of our bodies and personalities. So you have to have a little bit of both, and to try to make it one or the other is just unnecessary because it's both. There's fundamental patterns. As I say, you're not going to show fear ever in any way that anybody would confuse with happiness or benevolence and welcoming. So there are certain patterns that are very, very strict, but then you can play with it beautifully. And again, think about actors and how they have the great actors are the actors that will laugh and cry and present love and jealousy in ways that are very, very distinctive. Take somebody like, say, Laurence Olivier or Orson Welles, and the way they present certain things, or the great actresses of our time or any other time. They're things that are fairly unique to that particular actor in the presentation. And there are things that may have to do with the way they, for example, naturally laughed or cried, or may have been constructed, because the great actors are those people that think a lot about how they're going to portray these things, how they're going to portray it in front of a camera or across the stage in a theater with 1,000 people, and they have had to work all these details to produce a certain effect. And that's, of course, the difference between great acting.
That's like, I guess, method acting, right? Where you actually
exactly.
feel the role. You believe it. So you're giving off all the bodily cues that you would if you actually felt like that, because you actually feel like that.
Yeah. And of course, method acting at a certain point was very popular. But in the end, even if the methods of the teachers, the acting teachers, change, in the end, there's something that resembles all of them. There may be differences in details and how you structure a class, but there's an enormous amount of similarity. And our great attraction to film and theater, again, comes from how close they are to us. How close they are to us in the mechanics, and how close they are to us in what they can portray. And that's why no culture that is really rich has been without theater. Go back to the Greeks and Romans, and there was theater every which way, with or without music. Because music is another way of transmitting and representing the modulations of affect. That's what it's all about.
Yeah, here I'm reminded of Bob Triver's work on deception and self-deception, and that, if you actually believe the lie, your body's not going to give off the tells, the micro expressions and so on. And so, maybe, lie detection, we're not very good at it because most people come to believe their own lies, and therefore it's not really a lie if you really believe it. And that's my experience of dealing with like cult gurus and psychics and whatever who, bilk people, in a way they're kind of grifters, but in a way they're not, because they probably actually believe it. They've listened to their followers praise so much. They think, the David Koreshes or the Jim Joneses, they actually come to believe this stuff. So what they sell is pretty believable because they believe it. So, like an actor on stage, when they're up there addressing the group, they're pretty effective because of that.
Yeah. You might have a note for your viewers and listeners. Just as you were saying, I was thinking about Orson Welles and Ingmar Bergman. Here you have two gigantic authors, filmmakers, and both were consumed with magic. Orson Welles actually did several films and documentaries about magic, and so did Ingmar Bergman. So there's something that they recognized that was useful in their own way of conceptualizing what they were doing as actors, directors.
Yes, well, magic's definitely a form of performance. It's entertainment. And like acting,
exactly.
The magicians have to work to really sell it and present it in a way that's just astonishing.
Yeah.
And it's one of the reasons why it's no fun to learn how they do it. because most of the tricks are so simple. You're like, oh, that's what you did? Oh, I don't want to know that.
Yeah. Right.
You know,
Yeah, exactly.
I know David Copperfield is not making the Statue of Liberty disappear. I know he's not moving the atoms around, right? But so what? I mean, it's just it's fun to be astonished, and I don't want to know that he rotates the whole stage and he has some other setup or whatever that the people see. I don't want to know that. I'd rather just kind of be amazed.
Enjoy it. Yeah.
Yeah, enjoy it. Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
So let's address the so-called hard problem of consciousness. If I'm following you along here, the hard problem of consciousness is that what it's like to be something, right? So although I can't know for sure what it's like to be you, I can make a kind of a reasonable guess based on how I think and feel and how I can see you think and feel. And if you go back to your map metaphor, the self and then self-awareness and then consciousness would be based on, I guess, maps that are aware of all the other maps. And that's me. Some cognitive psychologists, as you know, say the self is an illusion. Well, if it is, it's a great illusion. It's pretty powerful. Exactly. I feel like I'm a single entity up there. However many modules or networks comprise myself, it feels like it's one unit. How do you think about the problem of the self and consciousness in that context?
Well, I think it's very useful to have a notion like the hard problem of consciousness. So I think we should thank David Chalmers for coming up with the term, not because I think the problem exists, but because I think it's useful to have the statement of the problem so that we can counteract it, contradict it. So I think that basically, it starts, the very beginning of our conversation was about something that I think people ignore most of the time, and I think is central to my book, and that this is not about the brain only. This is about the body and the brain. It's about life. So when I hear definitions of the hard problem of consciousness, how is it that we can build a mind from an organ like the brain, and have the brain, which is material, produce something which is immaterial called the mind? And that's a very typical description of this problem. I say, I don't know what the hell you're talking about, because the brain for me is not just bits of metal or a computer. It's actually in our case, very human flesh linked to the rest of the human flesh that makes up our body. So it's, to begin with, it's not about the brain. It's about this conjunction. And the minute you think about the conjunction, you realize that there are new entries into the problem. And then the other thing is to think of the mind as something that is immaterial. Why? Why should the mind be immaterial? If the mind is being constructed, as we for sure know is the case, in networks of neurons that are, of course, quite physical, why should it be immaterial? It is patterns that are being generated with all of its physiology, and I don't think it's more immaterial than this computer that I have in front of me and where your face is projected. And by the way, your face is not immaterial either, because your face is made up of all the technical details, which I'm not even going to venture describing, that make that image appear on my screen. So this is all about different aspects of physicality, but it is physicality, and it's it's hard in the sense that it has taken time for people to devise better and more accurate explanations of how this works. And I'm not claiming in any way that my explanations are the best or the last. They certainly are not the last. And the best, well, they're certainly better than many of those that I know, but I'm not claiming perfection of any kind. But I'm just saying that this is not about the brain alone. This is not nervous system alone. This is nervous system and body in a life situation. That's the critical issue.
So here we can bifurcate down two different pathways, AI and then immortality. So on the latter, when I was researching my book Heavens on Earth about the scientific attempts to achieve immortality, I was engaging your work on this idea that if you upload the mind, the connectome, just a perfect map, not possible at the moment, but let's say it was, of all your neural connections, every synaptic connection and so on, up into the cloud and turn it on, there you'd be. Well, you need your body. That's exactly. Not you.
Good.
Right.
No, exactly. We're totally on the same page. I mean, if you want to have access to formulas, be my guest, have access to formulas, but don't try to confuse a formula or an expression of what you are mentally with you. You is something very complicated that is you as a living creature right this minute engaging in all of this thinking about Antonio Damasio's feeling and knowing. It's a completely different story. Yeah.
Right. So it's not you up there in the cloud. It's just a copy of just your connectome, which isn't even your whole brain, and all the other interactions with your body, not to mention the interactions of your body with other bodies, with your environment, your social environment and your physical environment. All that goes into what makes up a human. And it seems to me that religious arguments for immortality would have the same problem. If you're upon your death, if your soul, whatever that is, floats off your brain or floats out of your body and up into heaven, wherever this is or whatever it is, it seems like they have the same problem. What's actually up there?
Yeah, exactly. No. I entirely agree. I think give me a little bit, give me the latitude and the longitude, so that we can find it.
I think theologians debate this, like whether it's your physical body is reconstructed in heaven, or it's just your soul, just the pattern of information. Which again, without the body, that can't be you. It can't be the same you anyway.
Yeah. No, I think these are interesting concepts that came at a time in which people's grasp of the reality of life, of course, very different, because there was not any science, or there was not much of it, and so the way you describe, especially things that are very complicated and are outside our immediate vision, such as the mind, in terms of the others, that of course is very different, and it opens lots of possibilities that have been explored in many philosophical and religious systems, which I think, the thing that is valuable about those systems is, of course, the kind of analysis they make of the human condition, and the kind of recommendations that they can make for how to live better once you are alive. And that's a different story from the conception of what is happening to your soul, or where your soul is, and so forth. Those are different considerations.
And also, if we take the whole life, the whole life chronology, if I'm uploaded now at age 67, but let's say I would have lived till 87, well, that's not the full me. I've just missed 20 years of whatever the memory patterns would have been. Or in the theological arguments, exactly. Some actually argue you're reconstructed as a physical body in heaven with God and Jesus or whatever. Well, what age? Well, they said, age 30 is about the right age, because that's when Jesus was crucified, and that's your ideal physical state. Well, but what happened to the 37 years of my life since I was 30? There's a whole set of memories there and patterns, and that's all gone.
Yeah, it's just gone to waste.
Yeah.
No, that's strange. That's for sure.
Yeah. But so then the other fork down to the AI route. How many, let's say, computer neural networks, whatever we want to call them, would it take for the computer to be sentient or conscious or whatever? Or is that even a right question to ask about AI and computers? You know the arguments, but how do you think about that?
Sure, of course. No. Oh, I think that it's possible to create very interesting simulations of minds, and but I think that the basic situation of AI is very good to solve problems for us technically. To store memories, to manipulate symbols, all that is terrific, and I'm all for it. But the idea that it captures what we are in terms of a human mind, and we have to part company. And we wrote a couple of years ago a paper that you may know that is published in Nature Machine Intelligence that was written with a colleague of mine, Kings and Men. And what we talked about is the possibility using something called soft robotics of making giving a sense of the vulnerability of an AI gizmo. In other words, a robot that instead of being perfectly incorruptible, perfectly indestructible, would be vulnerable. It would be vulnerable to the things we are vulnerable. And where are we vulnerable? It's expressed in our feelings: hunger, thirst, pain, well-being, malaise. All of these are feelings that are expressing our vulnerability, and we better heed what the conscious feelings are telling us, because if we don't, we get sick and die. So, what our idea was in this paper that attracted a lot of attention and a lot of people that loved it and a lot of people that hated it, I said, well, let's make the robots vulnerable. Let's make the robots have the possibility of quote unquote suffering from lack of something, because that's the life condition. The human condition is about the possibility of it's about the need of having regulation in order not to die and not to get sick. And so the big discussion is that for most people in AI, I think this idea is perfectly horrible, because it's why should you make a robot vulnerable when the robot is in fact indestructible? Unless you take an axe to it, it's indestructible. That's what we want, is perfect indestructibility. Well, I think that's fine. For certain things, it's not a bad idea. But if you want to do something that is more like a human being, you better be prepared to make it vulnerable, or it will not have anything at all to do with life or human beings. We are about vulnerability, the possibility of suffering, and the need to self-regulate.
You mean you want to give it emotions, like poor Data on Star Trek just didn't have emotions. So
exactly.
They got an emotion chip so he could learn to tell jokes and feel love and things like that.
Yeah. So, but that's a very interesting discussion for the day. I think we're not over in this discussion, but we've had it with several people, and it's quite the camps are very clear. The people that said that's a terrific idea. Let's think a little bit more about that, and the people that say, no, that's anathema.
But one of the arguments about the alignment problem in AI is that its goals will not be aligned with ours, and the counter argument to that is, well, you're assuming the computers feel and want things, and it's not going to want to take over the world or want to extinguish humans or anything like that. But if you give it emotions, then it may want that.
Right. Well, if you would give it a structure based on feelings, of course, it could become a bad. There are all sorts of bad things that could happen and good things. Basically, right now, the thing that interests me the most is the discussion itself. I'm interested by the intellectual problem, and that's what I would like to concentrate on. Yeah.
Years ago, I met David Ferrucci, who's head of the IBM project for Watson, the computer AI program that won Jeopardy. So I asked him, does it know that it won Jeopardy? I mean, was it excited that it beat the great Ken Jennings, the greatest Jeopardy player of all time? And he actually said yes, because he programmed it to to know that it won or whatever. But of course it doesn't know that it won. It doesn't even know it was playing Jeopardy.
Of course. Yeah.
But so in your analogy with maps, what if we gave Watson a map that you're playing Jeopardy, and then a map that knows that it's playing Jeopardy, and then a map that's happy that it won, that it's Jeopardy that it's playing, and so on.
Then you would be going in the right direction. Yeah.
Okay.
But it would be a long time to get there. That's for sure. Yeah. But you got the idea. For certain.
Right. So computers could be conscious and sentient if they had enough map program, enough neural networks. Or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Michael, something is happening on my screen. It says that it's blocking. Your view is partially blocked. I didn't do anything.
Okay. I don't know. Everything is okay on my end. I think we're all right.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to be conscious of your time too. I know you have a real job there, unlike me. So I just wanted to ask you.
You have a real job, yeah.
Since I have such a legendary thinker on my show here, I can't let you go without asking a few of the big questions, like free will and determinism. How do you resolve this, or compatibilism, or whatever the different positions are? How do you think about that?
Well, it depends on the circumstances in which you're asking the question. Clearly, we have at certain levels we have free will, or at least we better presume we have free will. So when I decide on who I'm going to vote on an election, of course, there's a considerable amount of free will right there. On the other hand, I know that I'm being conditioned by so many factors, historical and otherwise, so many factors that have to do with my knowledge and my prior reactions to different people and different parties, that in the end, free will probably does not exist. But it has to exist practically. So what I would say in questions like that is take two possible views. One, that's the strict scientific view, in which you're obviously going to be very limited, and another, which is the practical view. When I'm voting for person X, am I exercising my free will? And I would say yes, because I'm doing it to the best of my knowledge, according to what my values are and what I think the person that I want to vote for has in terms of merits. So I think you have to accept that not everything can be measured the same way and graded the same way and taken into the same definition. It's the only way out of the problem, for me.
Yeah, I agree. It seems to me that with the element of self-awareness, that I'm aware of the choices that are coming at me, and I'm aware that future Shermer is going to respond differently than current Shermer. So I can alter the future conditions, because I know, like tomorrow morning, I'm not going to want to get up early. So I'm going to set my alarm, and I'm going to put my workout clothes right here so that I'm ready to go, and so on. If we're aware that we're aware, your maps on maps on maps, and I know that my future self is going to act differently than my current self, I can currently choose to set the future parameters in a way to kind of nudge my behavior in a certain direction. That seems to me a kind of volition, whatever the right word is.
Yeah, it is. Of course, you can exert volition within certain, you can sort of make a limit, put a little rectangle around it, and within a certain way of defining the circumstances and the problem, you have volition. But it doesn't mean that you have all of volition. Michael, I'm getting a little bit short on time. So
yeah, let's wrap up. One last question. Let's wrap up. Where does consciousness go when I go to sleep or when I go under general anesthesia, and how does it come back? And where was it?
You turn it off. You turn it off. So when when under certain forms of anesthesia, for example, you make the process impossible. So you have this enormous complex chain of events that need to feed into each other for consciousness to exist. And you manage to disconnect it at a point that makes the entire thing stop. The same way that if you cut the electrical power that would start your engine, your car may be functioning perfectly well, but it will never start. You have, with different forms of anesthesia or sleep, what you have is ways of disrupting either the very process at low down, or the way in which you would register the process mentally. So, but in any case, what you do is not that you destroy it completely. You interrupt temporarily the possibility of making it. So think of anesthesia as a way, or certain grades of sleep, a way of temporarily removing the possibility of having consciousness without destroying the structure, without you just affect the functionality. Actually, analogies with things like power that you disconnect with a switch, things of that sort, are actually quite tolerable because they're not far from the truth. That's the answer to your question.
So with death, it just never comes back on because there's no more platform for it to come on.
Correct.
Is there any chance that our consciousness can continue on elsewhere after the death of our bodies?
If consciousness in the way that we can define, based on psychological observations, on theorizing about those psychological observations, and on the basis of the biology we know of body and nervous system, I would say no. But if something exists that is equivalent in terms of the structure and the function, I would say why not, except I just don't know what that would be.
Well, maybe we'll find out in the next life. Antonio, thanks for coming on the show. Thanks especially for your work. You're one of the most interesting writers and thinkers today. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thank you very much for talking to me. I enjoyed it.
All right.